Let's go ahead and get started with our HSRP lab. I just checked our connectivity between routers 2 and 3, which you should always do when you've been switching a lot of IP addresses in your labs. And we're ready to go there. I'm going to call one slight audible here, and we're going to use HSRP group 10 instead of 5. I'm tired of typing 5. We'll type 10 instead. So let's go ahead and get started with that. It's an interface level command, and it starts with standby. I believe iOS Help actually mentions that with standby. Let's see, standby, yes, HSRP interface configuration commands. It's kind of like Ether channel. You call it Ether channel, but you don't type the word Ether channel until you're actually verifying it, and you're not going to type HSRP very often with these commands. So let's go ahead. We're on the interface, and it is standby, and your group number is your first option, so that's the one we're going to take. And then we need to put IP, because that's what we're doing now. Enable HSRP and set the virtual IP address. That's the option we're using. And then you just put in the virtual address. And you can make it a secondary virtual IP address. Definitely not getting into that. So we're going to stop right there. And that's the only command we actually need to get started. Got the same thing on the Ethernet interface on router 2. Now your verification command for HSRP is show standby. That's going to give you really all the information you need. Pardon me. And right now local state is listen, priority 100. Hello and hold times, we certainly know what those are from other concepts, other protocols we've worked with. Says the virtual IP address is 172.12.23.10 configured. We certainly did that. Active router is unknown, standby router is unknown, and 0 state changes. I will warn you that HSRP is not always the fastest protocol in the world to cook, if you will. But let's go ahead, and now we're seeing one major difference. Active router is 172.12.23.3. Standby router is local. So that means we're on it. You also see at the very beginning of show standby that output local state is standby, priority 100. So we've got a virtual IP address. We've got an active router that's been elected as router 3 for some reason. Router 2, the one we're on, is the standby router. Let's go over to router 3 and compare the output of show standby. Looks pretty much, kind of inverse really. The local state is active because we were on the active router. And we see the same hello and hold times. We see the same virtual IP address. Active router is local, standby router is router 2. And then there's a big difference here at the bottom because there's a virtual MAC address listed. Where did that come from? We didn't do that. Now, if you were eagle-eyed when we were really looking at all these options for just a few seconds, there is a MAC address option here. So we could set one statically, it would appear, but we certainly didn't do that. So where is that MAC address coming from? Well, a lot of it is preordained, if you will, because it's a reserved MAC address. By default, your virtual router in HSRP, your active router, the virtual router, the pseudo router, if you will, it's going to have a virtual MAC address as well, and it's going to begin with 0000 0C07 AC. So where's that 0A coming from? I know you know this. Where's that 0A coming from? It's coming from the group number itself. If I had stuck with standby group 5, what we would be seeing there is 05. The end of this is your group number in hex. So of course, since we know our hex and we look at 0A, we know that A is 10, and that's exactly where that group came from. If we had picked group 17, we'd be seeing 11 right here, because that would be 1 unit of 16, 1 unit of 1. So again, very important concept for your exam. I bet you would see that in one form or another. That's where the MAC address comes from. Again, most of it is preordained. It's 0000 0C07 AC, and then the last two numbers are the group number in hex, and that's really it. So, so far so good here with our lab. We've got our setup going, but router 3 has been named the active router. So we know right now that we have this pseudo router at .10 but the router dot 3 is doing all the work. It's handling all the traffic. Well, let's just say that router 3 is not the most powerful router in the world, and we just got a brand new router over at router 2, and it's a workhorse. And we want router 2 to be the active, and we want 3 to be the standby. So we need to know how to do that, and it comes down to that priority that we saw. Because anytime you see priority with anything with Cisco, you know it's not just there for them to have something to talk about. It's got to be there for a reason. Now, the router with the highest IP address will be the active router unless one of them has a higher priority. The priority is actually the first value considered by HSRP when it comes down to who gets to be the active router. But they both had a priority of 100 by default. That's the HSRP default. So router 3 was chosen in the incredibly scientific method of having the highest IP address in the group. So they're just like, wow, okay, I really need router 2 to be my active router. So let's go over there and see what we could do about that. Standby 10. Whoop, that's what happens when you go to the interface first. Standby 10. And we have a priority level here. That sounds promising. And priority value 0 through 255. So that sounds good. So if we know the highest priority is going to win the election for the active router, let's just go ahead and be queued. We'll set it to 175. And we've got something called a preempt option there and CR, so we'll go with that. And let's see what we see. Okay, so the priority change was successful, 175. And again, that command is standby group number, priority, and then whatever you want the priority to be. And nothing else has changed. The active router has stayed the same. And you can see it even tells you what the priority of the active router is. It's 100. Standby router is local. So what do you think's going on here? What do you think we need to do to make this happen, to make router 2 the active router? What we actually need to do is use that preempt option. This sounds kind of violent, doesn't it? Overthrow? We have elections. This all sounds like a pretty democratic process. We've talked about elections since we started this course. Now all of a sudden we're overthrowing things. Well, overthrow's fine with me as long as it gets the job done here. What you are actually doing here is just saying, hey, even if there's an active router already chosen, which there probably is, I want this router to take over, because otherwise what you'd have to do if you didn't use the preempt option, you'd have to reload the routers. In router 2, it's just a mess. You have to sync things up and get the routers rebooted in just right order. It's just not the kind of thing we want to do on a production network. So let's go ahead and take that non-preempt command off. And then we'll repeat standby and just put preempt on the other side. And we get our config. Let's run. And look at that. We already got a standby message, a syslog message. Check that out. Standby 6 state change. It's even telling you what happened. State went from standby to active. If you don't see this, that means it probably didn't take effect. You might not be getting your messages to the screen, but that could be the case. That you left preempt off is much more likely. So let's run show standby now. And look at this. This is the key that you want to look for when you're running show standby. You want to see may preempt. If this is the router that should be the active router, no matter what else happens. So what happens here is local state is active, priority 175 can preempt. Now if we go over to router 3 and change that priority to 200 and put preempt, router 3 would become the active router again. But this just lets you have a router take over as active without doing all that reloading. Everything else stayed the same as far as the hello times, virtual IP address, etc. Notice the virtual MAC address is now listed over here. It's always going to be listed on your active router. And also note 2 state changes. So we did have a state change 28 seconds ago, and that's when router 2 took over. So a lot of important stuff there. The commands are not very complex at all. But you see exactly how to start your group, why your group number matters, because that's going to be at the end of your virtual MAC address. Again, you can change that. There may be real-world situations where you want to do that. But the big thing for your exam, frankly, is knowing where that default MAC address came from. And also now we've seen live that it's not just enough to raise the priority on the router that you want to be active. You need to put may preempt so it can take over from that current active router. That's it for this part of the lab. We're going to look around a little bit more on the next one, talk about a couple of other real-world scenarios, and then we'll move on to take a look at VRRP and GLBP. So I'll practice saying that real fast, and I'll see you in the next video.